Hi everybody, on 29th of August 2023, Nitin Gadkari revealed something that could bring yet another revolution in India.
एक दिन ऐसा हिंदुस्तान के इतिहास में आएगा कि पेट्रोल का इंपोर्ट पूरा खत्म हो जाएगा और पूरा किसानों ने तैयार किया हुआ इथेनॉल से इस देश के वाहन चलेंगे.
And this move could be so big that if it is implemented successfully, it could turn our farmers into millionaires. It could reduce the cost of petrol in the country to just 15 rupees a litre, and most importantly, this move can help control inflation in India. This move is none other than the introduction of something called flex fuel vehicles in India.
फ्लेक्स फ्यूल का
आने वाला कल पेट्रोल डीजल का नहीं बल्कि फ्लेक्सी फ्यूल का होगा.
And on 29th of August, this revolution took its first step. This is when the world's first prototype of Toyota electric flex fuel vehicle was introduced by Nitin Gadkari.
टोयोटा किर्लोस्कर द्वारा आज वो प्रोटोटाइप वर्ल्ड की फर्स्ट BS6 स्टेज 2 इलेक्ट्रिफाइड फ्लेक्स फ्यूल इनोवा गाड़ी आज लॉन्च हो रही है.
And to take this initiative one step further, on 9th of September 2023, India led the formation of something called the Biofuels Alliance on the side of the G20 summit. And now, India, Brazil and the US are the founding members of this alliance. So this move isn't just important for India, but also has a geopolitical significance. So in this episode today, let's do a deep dive and try to understand what exactly is so special about this concept of flex fuel vehicles, how the hell can it reduce the cost of petrol to just 15 rupees a litre and control something as powerful as inflation in India, how will it help the farmers of India, and most importantly, what is the Biofuel Alliance and why is it important for India? To understand the future of ethanol blending in India, we first have to study the past and understand where did this idea of ethanol blending come from. The answer to this question lies in something that happened in 1973 when the world was going through its first oil crisis.
People can no longer afford to run cars that do 12 miles to the gallon. Petrol stations can no longer afford to fill up cars whose tanks take 20 gallons.
This oil dealer is making his last delivery of the winter. When he returns to Bend, he will be out of oil.
For those who don't know, in 1973, the Arab-Israeli war broke out, and during this time, the United States supported the Israelis and gave them weapons and supplies. This made the Arabs extremely angry. So in order to teach the Americans a lesson, the Arabs decided to use their oil superpower and quadruple the price of oil from just $3 a barrel to almost $12 a barrel.
1973, when an OPEC oil embargo led to an international shortage and rocked the global economy.
And when this happened, there was a devastating impact on economies all across the world. And just like the pandemic, the entire world witnessed a recession, millions of jobs were lost, inflation skyrocketed, and every single industry faced the brunt of the oil crisis. But while all this drama was happening, there was one country that found a wonderful solution to this crisis and presented the world with a revolutionary concept. This country that I'm talking about is Brazil, and the solution that they came up with was something called ethanol blending.
30 years ago, as the price of gas rose, Brazil bet on a greener alternative when they began to distribute ethanol.
Motorists in Brazil fill up their tanks with ethanol. It is available at nearly every fueling station in Brazil and is roughly half the price of gasoline.
A certain amount of ethanol is mixed with petrol, which decreases both emissions and the consumption of petrol. And the best part about ethanol is that it can be obtained from various sources like sugarcane, wheat, corn, and even rotten potatoes. Therefore, at the macro level, it could significantly reduce the dependence on oil imports. Now in 1975, Brazil was facing two major problems. And listen to this very, very carefully because this is literally an insight into the present scenario of India. The first problem that they were facing was the drastic effect of the oil crisis. And secondly, in 1975, the sugar prices in Brazil collapsed because they had too much sugar but no buyers. So in order to tackle both these problems together, on 15th of November 1975, Brazil launched something called the Brazilian Ethanol Program, which was dedicated exclusively to the production of sugarcane fuel ethanol. And this program was established with three very important objectives. Number one, to reduce national dependence on oil imports. Number two, to promote technological and industrial development associated with ethanol fuel production. And lastly, to strengthen the sugarcane and sugar sectors in Brazil. And guess what? This was such a game changer for the Brazilian economy that during this phase of the ethanol program, sugarcane production increased by 50% and ethanol production skyrocketed by 500% to 2.8 billion liters. At the same time, the Brazilian government started pushing and subsidizing the auto companies to develop engines that were capable of running on 100% ethanol. So in just 9 years, by 1985, 96% of the vehicles sold in Brazil were ethanol powered vehicles. But you know what, guys? Here's where Brazil made one big mistake. They implemented all these policies with one underlying assumption that the oil price will never go down. And this is where the problem began.
A commodities trader here in New York today said, "Put on your hard hat, the sky is falling." That comment came as oil prices tumbled toward their lowest levels.
In 1986, suddenly the oil prices tumbled, and within a fortnight, ethanol vehicles became uneconomical. At the same time, sugar prices recovered and resulted into ethanol shortages, which further increased the price of ethanol. And last and most importantly, it further got messed up with the military dictatorship in Brazil. But you know what, guys? The fun fact is that in spite of all these ups and downs, it is estimated that Brazil still saved $50 billion in oil imports from 1975 to 2002 due to ethanol blending. Therefore, in 2003, the ethanol program was again revived, but this time with the introduction of something called flex fuel vehicles. Now pay very close attention to this. Flex fuel vehicles, as the name suggests, are those vehicles that are flexible with different fuel ratios. So they could take pure gasoline, pure ethanol, or a mix of both. These vehicles have sensors that can actually determine the fuel mix and adjust the operation of the vehicle accordingly. And this concept of flex fuel vehicles has been so widely accepted in Brazil that fast forward to 2023, over 89% of the new passenger vehicle sales in Brazil were flex fuel vehicles. And these vehicles allow the consumers to decide what type of fuel they want based on price and other factors. Therefore, flex fuel vehicles resolved that issue of ethanol blending that led to a collapse in consumer confidence in the late 1980s. So this time, Brazil actually achieved some incredible milestones. Since 2003, Brazil's emissions of carbon dioxide have been reduced by more than 630 million tons, which is equivalent to taking out 137 million cars off-road or planting 4 billion trees. And most importantly, they've significantly reduced their dependence on oil imports. So what does this tell us? Ethanol is not an alternative to petrol, but a complementary product to petrol to reduce the cost and reduce carbon emissions. Number 2, ethanol can reduce cost because we have a ton of sugarcane in India, which makes ethanol production economical. And lastly, ethanol cannot eliminate fuel price fluctuation, but decrease the magnitude of the fluctuation because we are not dependent on foreign countries for ethanol. If this is very, very clear to you, let's understand what all this information has got to do in the Indian context. And if you look at the scenario in India and the world, it's very, very similar. Just like Brazil in the 1970s, even India and other countries are heavily dependent on oil imports. India is currently importing more than 80% of its crude oil from the foreign markets. And if you look at what's happening lately, even after multiple requests by India and other countries, the OPEC has deliberately curtailed the oil production, which is causing inflation all across the world. Just like Brazil, as of 2023, we have a humongous infrastructure for sugar and sugarcane. In fact, for the 5th straight year, we will be producing sugar in surplus. And as of 2020 alone, we had 6 million tons of sugar in excess. Therefore, there is a dire need to utilize these resources. And just like the 1970s, due to the war, fuel prices have shaken the Indian economy with inflation. This is the reason why the Indian government is preparing to de-risk the economy with ethanol blending and flex fuel vehicles. So in simple words, we can mix ethanol with petrol. Petrol prices will drop down by 10 to 20%. Inflation will come under control and everything will be perfect, right? Well, if any media channel tells you this, you got to stop watching that channel, because ethanol has some very important challenges that need to be tackled before it can have wide-scale adoption. So the question over here is, what are these challenges? Let's start with the supply side challenges first. The first main challenge back then was the lack of feedstock. For those who don't know, feedstock is a raw material that is required to produce ethanol. So back then, the government had only allowed C molasses to be used for ethanol production. And if you don't understand C molasses, don't worry, it's very simple to understand. In the process of sugar production, juice is extracted from sugarcane and the remaining liquid is called as molasses. And as sugar crystals are removed, the leftover liquid is boiled again and again to produce more sugar. So every time you boil it, a different grade of sugar is produced. And this is where you get 3 grades of molasses: A, B and C. A molasses is the highest quality, lightest and sweetest grade of sugar. This is the grade that is actually used in baking. Then we have the second boiling cycle where you get B molasses. This is also the kind of sugar that is used in baking. But in the third cycle, you get C